vengeance!
Hit the pace car! What for? Because you hit every other damn thing out there. I want you to be perfect.
When I'm driving, I got a guy on the radio who talks to me. It's him. He talks to me.
Well, I wanna be a race car driver. Pretty girls eating from my hand, yeah. Wanna live a life of fun and danger. No sweater working for the man, alright. Well, hey. Well, I wanna be a firefighter. Cool-headed when the heat is on, yeah. Save my baby from the burning building. Take her home with the sprinklers on, alright. Well, alright.
No, he didn't slam you, he didn't bump you, he didn't nudge you. He rubbed you. And rubbing, son, is racing.
Good evening, race fans. Welcome to the Hoobazoo Radio Network, and welcome to the Drafting the Circuits radio program. My name is Frank Santoroski. I'll be your host for the next hour as we discuss everything racing. Joining me in the studio tonight is Mr. Seth Eggert from Motorsports Tribune, Mr. Richard Youden from my favorite race engineer. A little later tonight, Joey Barnes from IndyCar.com will be on the program. How is everybody tonight?
Doing good.
Very good, thank you.
Let's knock out the headlines real quick. Daytona 500, the Gibbs cars went 1, 2, 3 out of 7 cars that were left. And in the process, Denny Hamlin becomes a two-time Daytona 500 winner. Speaking of guys that have won at Daytona twice, we've got a special guest in here with us tonight from Atlanta, Georgia, Spencer Pumpelly, who drives the Porsche Cayman in the SRO Motorsports Pirelli GT4 America Series for the Racers Group, is with us tonight. Spencer, how you doing?
I'm doing great. How are you guys?
Oh, wonderful, wonderful. So thanks for coming on the show. Let's briefly let our listeners know who you are. I know that you grew up in a racing family. Your dad used to run the old IMSA Camel GT series, I believe. So you've been around racing your whole life. Have you kind of always wanted to be a race car driver from hanging out with your dad at the track, or is it something that you kind of thought of later?
Well, if you think way back to the late 80s and IMSA GTP cars, I mean, there was glamorous cars, a lot of attractive women, exotic locations, downtown Miami, Long Beach and California and all over the East Coast. It was just, as a 13-year-old, if you're around that environment, it's not hard to get that bug to go race. And that's where it started for sure. So yeah, I kind of always wanted to do that. The path that led me to actually get from there, watching, all the cool 962s and Nissans and Jaguars race, to where I'm racing now, was long and crooked. But I'm here now, and that's kind of really where it all began.
All right, well, fantastic. So now, we had just mentioned you're a two-time winner at Daytona. Now, that's not in the 500. That's in the Rolex 24. And I know you guys thought the Daytona 500 was a pretty long race this past weekend, but the 24 is even longer. Seth, you've been down there to the Daytona, the Rolex 24. Now, Spencer, it's just an amazing atmosphere down there, because you've got literally hundreds of drivers down there, and you've got drivers from every discipline in the world. There are a bunch of IndyCar guys will be in there. You'll have some current and former Formula One guys. A couple of guys will come out of NASCAR and try their hand at the road course there in a sports car. So when you're there for the 24 hours and you've got your breaks and whatnot, is there a sense of camaraderie amongst all those drivers? I mean, do you guys kind of seek out one another and trade stories? Is it a bit like a big reunion?
Well, yeah, absolutely. There's a lot of that to it. Unfortunately, last couple of years, I've been finding myself running both the 24 and the Continental Tire Sports Car Challenge, which now this year is the Michelin Pilot Cup. And so that keeps you very busy, because you got to do all the practices and then all the racing. And there hasn't been a ton of time to actually go out and meet some of the guys like Alonso, who's been there recently. But one of the neat things for the fans and for the drivers is we do get to kind of interact with some of the other drivers from other disciplines. In 2011, when I won the race with the Racers Group, I had Andy Lally, who's a good friend, was one of my co-drivers. And we had Wolf Hensler, who was a Porsche factory driver, and a gentleman from Chicago named Steve Berthaud. But we needed a kind of another ringer to come and help us win the race. And Kevin knew Brendan Gaughan, as did Lally from their time in NASCAR. So Brendan came over and was just absolutely impressive with his road racing skills and was a big part of our win in 2011. And then I want to say in 2009, Bobby Labonte was driving for TRG in Nextel Cup, I guess it was back then, or maybe it was Sprint Cup. And we got him to come and drive with some of the top Porsche factory drivers. We had Romain Dumont, Emmanuel Collard, myself. And Bobby's pace, his first day in the Porsche at Daytona, was on par with absolutely all those guys who had spent their lives driving those Porsches all over the U.S. So I was really impressed, and it's an opportunity for us to kind of talk to those guys about what they do, learn more about it. And, of course, I'm a Brendan Gaughan fan for life now, and I always try to follow his racing. And, of course, Bobby's not driving anymore, but I would, follow him too. So we feel like we have a connection to everyone when you get to Daytona.
Yeah, it is quite an amazing event. So now, as far as the rest of your schedule is concerned, we've talked about you ran the Lamborghini for Magnus Motorsport at the Rolex 24, and you'll be doing a few other endurance races with them this year. The SRO Pirelli GT4 series takes you to some pretty good tracks. I believe you're running at COTA. You're going to run at Virginia. You've got a couple weekends where you're partnered up with the Indy cars and whatnot. I believe you're at Long Beach. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's correct. So we go to a bunch of really unique venues that we don't really get a chance to run in sports car racing a lot. St. Pete's one of them. We run with IndyCar there. And then in Long Beach, and that's always one that you watch IndyCar guys drive and hope to get to. And then slowly they've been integrating different sports car series in as a support race. And so I've been fortunate enough to run that event 3 or 4 times. And that's another one coming up. Long Beach is probably the spiritual home of TRG, even if the team's based out of Northern California. The team owner, Kevin Buckler, grew up in that area and really got the bug for racing, watching cars out Long Beach. So that's one of those places where I know he really wants to win this year. And then we have a lot of people that support us out down in the Tampa, St. Pete area. So those will be some fun venues. And then we get to race at Sonoma, which is basically the backyard of the team. So yeah, I'm looking forward to the schedule, the series. VIR is probably the best venue we have in the U.S. Get to run there, and if this Porsche is as good as we think it is, it should be a good season.
Should be. Now, speaking of Porsche, you've driven the bulk of your career in Porsches. I've heard you referred to as a Porsche specialist by one of your PR folks, Gail. She called you a Porsche specialist. So, and again, Porsche is one of the storied marks of racing. They've set the bar in sports car racing time and time again. So, I mean, just what to you? You've driven some other type cars out there, but to call yourself a Porsche driver, is that something that you take a lot of pride in?
Well, I think nowadays, now that we've gone to the GT3 spec, the cars have actually become a lot closer as far as what the difference in the Lamborghini versus an Audi versus a Ferrari versus a BMW and a Porsche kind of feel and drive like. But back in, say, 2013, when we were running in the American Le Mans Series with the GTC category, where the cars were definitely rear engine and raw, there was only a handful of guys that were really quick in them, and to be amongst those guys, it was really cool. So I love the mark. I like the cars, but to me, if it's competitive, I like to drive it. I think my favorite race I've ever run in my career was the ARCA race in New Jersey in a 800 power car that had 800 horsepower car that had zero grip. But the Porsche is kind of my wheelhouse. I know them really well, and when I get in them, I just kind of know setup-wise what they want. I know exactly how they need to be driven. And so I think that's a big advantage, and it helps kind of, it helps me exploit the car and kind of take advantage of what it can do more so than some of the other makes.
All right. Now, Seth, you've got a question. I know, Seth, you and I were discussing the overall health of sports car racing, and you had some comments and questions on that.
Yes, I did. As far as sports car racing is concerned, my understanding is Jim France had a lot of help in saving sports car racing, at least here in North America. And now he is heading NASCAR. Spencer, how much did he do for sports car racing? And now that he's in NASCAR, how much do you think his leadership experience in IMSA and sports cars will apply there?
He has always been committed to sports car racing to the point where I think we owe a vast majority of where the sport is right now to his vision and his consistent support of the sport. There's been a lot of other people that have obviously had big influences. Don Panos, you think of one of them, but if you think about the influence that the France family's had on sports car racing, he's one of the guys that is really responsible for what you saw at Daytona, where you have a huge entry of top-notch teams, cars that are all professionally run, some of the best drivers in the world. And you think about the class I was in, GTD, there was 23 cars, and I would say 21 of them really had a legitimate shot to win. So that type of environment that they've created, especially when you think about where it came from 20 years ago, where it was kind of a hodgepodge of different ideas and teams and cars and philosophies, he's done a fantastic job. He's had great help. I think he's attracted good people, and I think everything that he's done is going to help wherever he goes. And NASCAR obviously is near and dear to him as well. I hope he doesn't lose focus on what we're doing, because I think he's still a big part of IMSA and sports car racing. But I think if NASCAR is going to kind of move in the future, he's probably one of the guys that can help kind of lead it to new leadership and take the reins and go forward.
And speaking of venues as well, something NASCAR did last year, they ran their first Roval race, as they called it, at Charlotte. And there was a lot of talk in the off-season of possibly IMSA running that course sometime in the near future. Would that be something you're interested in doing?
I think the Rovals have historically been tough for IMSA, with the exception of Daytona. And one of the reasons is it's difficult to attract fans in some of those markets. Now, I don't know how well sports car racing would play in Charlotte, but I do know that even if we had a huge crowd in sports car terms, the place would still kind of look empty when we got there. So it's one of those things where we've historically stayed away from them. It might be worth a try, but you know what? If we're going to try something new, I'd say let's go to an oval. Let's see what that Lamborghini can do at Richmond. Let's see what a Porsche GT4 does at Bristol. I mean, if we're going to mix it up, let's do that.
And speaking of trying something different, I know you said you ran the ARCA car at New Jersey Motorsports Park a few years ago. And with having the connections to Brendan Gaughan and Bobby Labonte, have you ever considered essentially being a road course ringer in NASCAR, running one of the road course races, whether it's in the Cup Series or the Xfinity Series, like how Andy Lally has done recently?
Yeah, Andy Lally works very, very hard every year to try to put together those deals. And he's always been a NASCAR fan. And I think if he had his pick from a young age, he would have been a NASCAR driver. But as your career kind of takes its turns and opportunities arise, he ended up being a sports car driver. I would also love to be a NASCAR driver. I'd love to do some ovals. I'd love to do more road courses. But I think at my age, which is now 44, there's so many younger kids that probably have bigger futures and they'll get some of those investment dollars their way. I think it'd be an uphill battle. And to be honest, I've got my hands pretty full running the series that I race in sports cars and doing some of the coaching I do. So as much fun as I had in that ARCA race, nothing really came of it. I tried to find my way into a couple Xfinity races and some Sprint Cup back then, but it just didn't pan out. So I'm here and I'm ready to go, but at the same time, I'm not holding my breath.
Now, have you ever had the opportunity to, while you've been running the sports cars, to in a testing situation or a racing situation, hop in and run one of the prototype cars?
I have actually. I actually raced a Daytona prototype in, I want to say it was 2006. It was over 10 years ago, but it was a good taste of a prototype. And then a couple test days, I've jumped in some high power radicals, things like that. I'm pretty much committed to the GT cars. I find that when I hop in those, they just kind of come naturally. I kind of felt the same way in the ARCA car, but when you get in the higher downforce stuff where you're doing more turning with the steering wheel and less with kind of the pedals, I feel like it's a different driving style, one that I could adapt to over time, but I'm not going to jump in anything right away and set the world on fire.
Now, I did hear a story that one of your Rolex 24 wins, you were missing the clutch in the car for a good bulk of the time. and yet you still won the class. How how kind of harrowing was that to try to run that without the clutch?
It was tough because, well, first off, I was in the car when it let go. I think my co-driver Wolf had a little off, and something went up and took out the line right by the gearbox, which in that car obviously is, behind the driver in front of the engine. And so when he came in the pits, it kind of chugged to a stop. And so when I left, there was still a little pressure in it, but it didn't want to go into gear. And we were still allowed to push the cars back then. So the guys gave me a little push and off we went. But after a couple laps, it was completely gone. And we decided, we knew for sure if we pitted to fix it, we would be out of the race. And we were leading at the time. So we decided to forge on. Now, in a lot of cars, you don't really need the clutch. But in that particular car, you needed it for downshifts because the sequential gearbox didn't really go from one gear through a neutral to the next. It went right from one to the other. So it would very frequently grind, and to try to rev the engine to match the revs, it was almost impossible without the clutch because it was never in neutral. So we were pretty sure the gearbox wasn't going to last. And then, of course, we had a long yellow flag for fog that year. And that was really tough, just kind of chugging around under yellow, not being able to stop the car on track. There's a couple times when the field would kind of slow down in an accordion, and you'd have to just chug along and pass a couple cars. And then when it spread back out, you have to fall back into line. But sure enough, we forged on, knowing that if we spun, the race would be over. And myself and the rest of the guys, Brendan, Andy, Wolf, and Steve, they were able to kind of nurse it. And sure enough, the gearbox had probably another 5 hours left on it. We did our damage, but it wasn't so bad that that we were really kind of weren't going to make it.
Oh, that's amazing. So now, Richard, you'd like to chime in here?
Yeah, I just got a couple of questions, just more from a curiosity point of view, and to try and get your opinion on a few things. Yeah, you mentioned earlier when you've been running the Daytona 24, you have a lot of drivers from sort of a diverse background. Do you think that the likes of Alonso coming over and some of the IndyCar drivers and some of the NASCAR drivers coming over and racing that series, do you think in a way that sort of detracts from the job that you guys do? Because the sport obviously gets more attention for that race, but it's only because they're there. I don't know if you get what I'm trying to ask here.
Yeah, I get what you're trying to say, and I never really thought of it that way. To me, the more attention we can bring to what we do, I think the better. And yeah. I never saw someone coming over to join us for the 24 as being kind of a front to what we do. To me, it was always an extra. It was something fun, a new experience, someone to learn from. Especially you just look at their take on racing in general, not necessarily how they drive that particular car, but what's their philosophy on the big picture and how do they approach their job. They have a pretty interesting job when they come over. They got a full season deal that's going on without them after they leave. So, if they mess up, if they crash the car, they could ruin a championship for other people that they're never going to see again the rest of the season. So it's definitely a tough situation for them. But no, if someone were to come over and kind of take away a seat for the season, that would be a different thing. But I think the sports car drivers we have out there right now are a pretty good bunch. The one thing in recent years, though, is that since we've gone to these driver ratings, and I'm not 100% sure all your listeners are going to be familiar with them, but in sports car racing, thanks to the big amateur presence that we've always had throughout the years, we've tried to, as a community, formalize who's a professional, who's an amateur, and where you rank. So at Daytona, at least in my class, we can't really add a lot of drivers thanks to the driver rating requirements. In GTD, you're only allowed to have 2 drivers that are above a gold rating. So unfortunately, the year we brought in Bobby Labonte, we wouldn't be able to do that again this year. So one thing the driver ratings has hurt, among many, many other problems it's created in racing, is that we can't bring the guys like Bobby Labonte or Brendan Gaughan over anymore because we got to go find sneaky silver drivers to join the team.
Yeah, no, I think it's. I mean, I think the way that the series, such as the IMSA Endurance Series and IndyCar's going, I think they're both two fantastic series, and from a purist standpoint in terms of watching racing, I think they're second to none. I can't think there's anything more entertaining up there. I think it's interesting to get your thoughts on where sort of NASCAR sits at the moment from a driver's standpoint, because obviously that's still in the US, that's the series that gets all the coverage, it gets all the attention, it gets all the media and column inches. But as a product, I think it's fair to say, and I'm sure Seth and Frank sort of share his opinion, it's not where the quality of the racing and the quality of the show doesn't match the media presence it gets in a negative way, whereas IMSA and IndyCar doesn't get the media presence it deserves in a positive way, if you like. Do you think that over time it'll balance out and the series that you race in and IndyCar will continue to grow and that NASCAR will fall, or do you think NASCAR can sort of reinvent itself a little bit?
Oh, well, in my personal opinion, I do think NASCAR needs to do some soul searching. I think as a product, a lot of road racers when I first started racing would poo-poo it. I've always been a huge fan. And then once I got involved when I was driving for TRG in the late 2000s, early 10s, and got to see from a sports car side of that company what they were doing on the NASCAR side, I even increased my appreciation for how hard and difficult it is. But right now, I've got a young kid who's 6 years old, and he's a huge Chase Elliott fan, but he can't sit through a 4.5 hour race. He can't sit through a long single file parade for hours and hours. It doesn't really mean anything till the end. I do think they need to find a way to, without using gimmicks, make it more competitive and make it more compact. Why those races need to take as long as they're currently taking, I have no idea. I think they could do it all in a 2 hour show. For example, we had 4 cars wreck at Daytona last week, and for some reason we're under red flag for half an hour. We wrecked 4 cars in sports car racing. I think it takes a long time when it's 5 laps under yellow, and here we are half an hour sitting there waiting. And then, I understand having, the 600 being a long race. I understand having Daytona being a long race, but the average race doesn't need to last as long. And I think there's other issues too. Now, I think sports car racing, though, as we've seen, is more gentleman driven. So in order for sports car racing to be successful, we need to have a healthy paddock. Whereas in order for NASCAR to be successful, they need to have a healthy fan base. I think they're 2 different challenges. And I think those things are going to be on 2 different cycles always as the economy kind of comes and goes and people make investments. For sports car racing, I think we're doing really well now that the economy is good, but I hope we have the ability to adjust quickly when suddenly $3.5 million, $4 million GTD budgets aren't going to match with a shrinking economy. So to answer the question, I don't have a really good answer. But and then IndyCar, I watch as a fan, mostly the 500, but I see huge potential there as the racing is fantastic. Indy never fails to disappoint, and they've got great racing throughout the season, and it's compelling stories behind it. I have no idea where that's going to go either, but that's my take on everything. I haven't, it's a great question. I can't answer it.
Yeah, I'm sure the marketing people with all 3 series probably can't answer it either. It's a difficult one, isn't it? But you raised the point there when you've worked with the NASCAR guys and being close to there. I think one of the issues it has is that the driving standards are actually massively underrated. Everybody sits there and thinks, oh, these guys just turn left all the time, but there is a huge skill to it. And, I was lucky enough to work with some pretty good drivers through that time. In fact, Brendan Gaughan, I worked with him a little bit on and off for a couple of years. And, the talent levels of these guys are huge, but they don't really get the respect and the sort of, these guys are really, really good drivers. They're not just a face or a PR tool. These are damn good drivers, these guys.
Well, they have always been, in my opinion, some of the best in the world. And that's why I think when you see guys doing crossovers and going really fast, Jeff Gordon, I'm sure, could have raced anything. Tony Stewart was one of those once in 20-year talents that come along. There's a bunch of them over there that could have been successful anywhere they decided to go, but happened to find their path to NASCAR. That's definitely the case. I hope that continues. As I watch NASCAR, I don't know if I'm right about this, but the outside observation seems to be that's going to more of a series where the funding takes precedent as far as what you need to get into the seat. Now, that's not to say that it hasn't always been the case part of the way in every racing series since racing started, but it seems to me that lately the stars we have seem to have come out of nowhere 3 years ago, and I don't see them the same gritty guys that cut their teeth on the short tracks that we had when the last generation got up to fame and fortune in NASCAR. Is that matter? I don't know. I see that, and am I right? I don't know either, but that's just kind of the impression I get from the outside.
Now, my question, NASCAR, since we're on that topic, NASCAR has said nothing is off the table as far as trying to build their fan base back up. One of their questions to the fan council this past weekend was, would you want to see a NASCAR race on a street course? Do you think it's possible to have, whether it's the Cup Series, the Xfinity Series, or the Truck Series, anything like that, on a street course like Long Beach or any other one like Belle Isle?
Well, I think that could the cars race there? Absolutely. Would it be a good race? Probably. Definitely would be exciting. There would definitely be some action. The infrastructure, I think, is always the tough part there, but that's not to say it's impossible. So, yeah, if they can find a way to get the crowd, the teams, and everything to work at Long Beach, absolutely. They should definitely try that. There's a lot of things I think they could do. One of the engineers I've worked with in the past, who I think is one of the top guys out there, is a guy named Jeff Brown, Colin Brown's dad, and he did an interview with some friends of mine where he talked about what he would change if he got into racing, and he was able to wave a magic wand. And one thing he said was he would reduce the downforce across the board in every series by 50%, probably better yet 70%. And I think if NASCAR could get rid of the aero packages that cause a lot of the racing to not be as good, and we could just get rid of a lot of that side force and let the cars kind of work on their tire and their suspension, that might help make the racing better. But as far as attracting a fan base, there's a lot of potential out there. The biggest thing is I think you've got to stay away from gimmicks. You got to go with, hard work, putting the series together, making sure that the races are compelling because they're good races and because we want to see an outcome that happens on the track, not before everyone gets there. And then I think the fans will come back.
Absolutely, yeah. So, Spencer, before we close out, I want to give you a couple minutes to, plug your sponsors. Let us know where we can find you on social media. I know we'll find you next on a racetrack at St. Pete in the weekend of March 8 to 10. So if you want to just go ahead and plug your projects for us, your sponsors, and your social media, we'd appreciate that. Let our fans know where they can find you and reach out to you.
Oh, thanks. I appreciate that. Spencer Pumpelly at Twitter is probably the best way to go. I'm also on Instagram at Spencer_Pumpelly, I believe. I actually had an account get hacked, and I had to change my thing a long time ago, so I always forget which one was actually the real one, which one was the hacked one, but I'm pretty sure Spencer_Pumpelly is the one. And then I'm going to be racing this year for the Racers Group in the Pirelli SRO GT4 Sprint Championship, so we'll be racing like some of the tracks we talked about earlier, and that's a championship that I believe is 8 rounds with 16 events. And our sponsors this year are going to be the Racers Group, who's the team that's putting the effort together. Adobe Road Winery makes fantastic wines. I'm not as quite up on the wine knowledge as the guy that runs it, who is just he's like a college professor on how you make good wines. But all I know is that they're fantastic, and after the races, I really enjoy them. And then we've got LaSalle Solutions helping out, and a lot of other good partners there. And then I'm also going to be running the NAEC, the North American Endurance Championship, with Magnus Racing and Lamborghini over in the IMSA side of things. So there's a lot coming up, a lot to be excited about this year. Hopefully the World Challenge stuff leads to a championship, and hopefully the Magnus team does good with and without me, and we'll come to the end of the season with some smiles on our face and do it again next year.
All right. Well, we wish you the best of luck in your 2019 season, and we'll follow you. We'll keep up with you, and maybe at the end of the season, you can come on here and talk about winning that championship. So
Yeah.
we do wish. All right. So listen, go ahead, sir.
Yeah. Thanks again for having me. All the best, guys.
All right, guys. Hey, we're going to take a quick commercial break. Everybody, we'll be right back. You're listening to Drafting the Circuits.
Do you owe back taxes to the IRS or state? The secret to avoiding the IRS nightmare is to seek professional representation. My friends at Security Tax Associates provide the most cost-effective and ethical representation in the industry while helping to avoid seizures, levies, and wage garnishments. Security Tax Associates is here to ensure that the appropriate steps are taken to permanently eliminate any possibility of future tax burdens once and for all. For a free, no-obligation consultation, contact Security Tax Associates, 844-779-4177. That's 844-779-4177. 844-779-4177. Or visit them at securitytaxassociates.com.
And we're back. Hey, welcome back to the Hoobazoo Radio Network. You're listening to Drafting the Circuits. What a great interview with Spencer Pumpelly, huh? Fantastic guest. Hopefully, we wish him the best this year. But guys, let's get our racing report out of the way. Let's talk about the Great American Race, the Daytona 500. This one, it took a while to get it in. It finished rather late, finished under the lights. But like we mentioned earlier, at the end of the day, Gibbs cars up front. Denny Hamlin snaps a pretty significant losing streak. I don't believe he put a race win up last year at all. So a great way for Denny to start his season. So Seth, Richard, you guys watched the race. Let's talk about it, Seth.
Well, for Hamlin, he is, I think, the seventh driver who went winless the previous season to win the season opening Daytona 500. But 1, 2, 3, the first time since 1997 when Hendrick went 1, 2, 3 in the 500. You had Joey Logano and Michael McDowell rounding out the top five, surviving the chaos at the end. But overall, it was a very interesting race. If they were single file for maybe 5-10 minutes, that was a lot compared to the duels and the Clash and the Xfinity race, which had a lot of people concerned that it was going to be single file all day long. You had Jimmy Johnson, Stenhouse, and a few others try to do a very sneaky, we're not going to tell anyone we're pitting, and it came back to bite them because people further back couldn't slow up in time. Cody Ware went spinning, taking out Tyler Reddick, the rear end of Jimmy Johnson's car. I don't know how they were able to fuel that at the very end. He actually got penalized for improper fueling. Somehow was able to come back and finish on the lead lap. Matt DiBenedetto led the most laps ever in his career, not only in a single race, but he led more laps in the 500 than he has in his career to date in the Cup Series. And that is after taking a chance, moving over to Levine Family Racing, back to Toyota. It was just an interesting race overall.
So speaking of Michael McDowell, right? So, good run for the guy. Again, Daytona is hardly a good barometer of how your season's going to go. But Levine, they've been, they've always been a pretty good, middle of the pack team. But they definitely look sharp. Huh?
You said McDowell. That's DiBenedetto.
Matt B. Yeah. Okay. Pardon me. One of them M guys. Yeah, I know Michael McDowell had the problem that he doesn't get paid to push Joey Logano around, but we're talking about Matt DiBenedetto, and taking over the ride vacated by Casey Mears, correct?
Casey Kane.
Okay, so you see, I'm the IndyCar guy here, so Seth. But you know what my question is, right? Do you feel like this move, even though we're only one race in, this could be fruitful for this team? It just seemed like as a team that they all kind of gelled and worked well together, even on just a short time.
I think so, and in the long run, I honestly think he'll make the playoffs this year. In that, I think that would be a win for the team. Just overall, after the way they came into the sport, running part-time, aligning with Richard Childress Racing, splitting races to have Austin Dillon and Ty Dillon in their cars at times, and then going over, aligning with Hendrick, and now moving over to be aligned with Toyota and Gibbs. I don't think they're next Furniture Row Racing because they don't have the same people. They don't have the same philosophy. They're not out in the middle of essentially nowhere like how Furniture Row was out in Denver, Colorado. But at the same time, I think that they will at least have some semblance of a team that came in on their own terms, moving to be competitive on their own terms.
All right. Now, Richard, you have some impressions of this race?
Yeah, I thought it was more entertaining, as Seth said, than it could have been. Thankfully that second row, that second lane formed, and there was some pretty good racing out there. But in a way, there's a bit of an anticlimax there at the end with no real passing at the end, and I think it was a bit of a shame that we lost so many cars, 10 or so laps from the end, because there wasn't enough cars that were intact and running quickly at the end of the race to form a second line. So Denny Hamlin pretty much had it all sewn up there. He knew that none of his teammates were going to do anything really stupid back there. But no, it was good. I think it was one of the more entertaining 500s, and obviously onto Atlanta next week, weather permitting.
And just one more thing that made at least the overall race entertaining, or at least one specific part. Ryan Preece, that wreck avoidance, shooting through the middle almost like it was Days of Thunder, and he wasn't the only one to do it. He was just the only one that the broadcast TV showed. On the first overtime attempt in that wreck, that was when Preece shot through the middle, avoided spinning Chase Elliott on the apron, and a spinning Stenhouse and Larson up on the banking. I don't know how he got through that without spinning, because he was straddling the banking and the apron with the different degrees. Usually when drivers try to do that, the car just gets loose and wipes out. And he went back on the second overtime attempt and juked the car to the inside, avoiding another wreck, while at the same time Eric Jones shot through the middle, avoiding the carnage. And for him, it was like the seas parted like Moses. At the same time, that happened for Jones. Next to Jones was Brendan Gaughan. While the seas parted for Jones, Gaughan's car got destroyed in the big one.
A lot of cars got destroyed in that big one. So now, Richard, I want to ask you this, because I'm just following up on a social media comment that I read, but somebody had mentioned that the amount of sparks flying from underneath the cars during that big one there was twice what we're used to seeing. And I have to agree that one that Fox TV was so nice to show over and over again in super slow motion. But there were a tremendous amount of just sparks flying from underneath the car. Is that due to a lowered ride height or anything like that, or was it just the way that the cars were scraping against the concrete?
A bit of both there. I mean, also it was at night, so it was dark, I think, when that wreck happened, so it's obviously far more visual. But I believe it was 2 years ago, maybe 3 years ago, that NASCAR removed the height rules for super speedways.
3 years ago.
3 years ago, yeah. So, in the past, NASCAR used to provide the springs for the shocks for the car, so they were set at a restricted height, whereas now his teams used to manipulate those and play silly games with them. Now NASCAR said, oh, you know what, just do whatever you like. So the cars do run lower to the ground than they used to, for sure. And that may have had something to do with it. But
on top of that, you also had the rear bumper extension that went all the way down to the ground.
Sure, yep.
So with people blowing tires in the big one, as they spun or this or that, that was also dragging, increasing the sparks.
Yeah.
And we did, speaking of tires, right? We saw a couple catastrophic tire failures. I remember Keselowski had the one, because I actually had to make the joke that, it's the car sponsored by Discount Tire, has the tire blowout in grand fashion. But then a few laps later, I believe, or earlier, Kyle Larson had just the tire just go away. Again, now, Richard, we've talked about this a little bit, or Gray and I have certainly talked about this. Is it a problem with the product that Goodyear is bringing, or is it the team's manipulation of the pressures and whatnot? Because the funny thing is, you watch IndyCar racing, right? And IndyCar drivers will tout Firestone as a wonderful tire provider, and they cannot say enough good things about them. And you just don't see these sort of things. But it's not uncommon to get a NASCAR guy to just kind of trash Goodyear publicly. And I think, Tony Stewart most famously. But is Goodyear bringing their A game to NASCAR this day and age, or are they phoning it in? Well, that's a tough question.
It's a tough question.
You don't work for Goodyear, so
no.
If I can get in the middle real quick, at least for Larson, that tire was because of contact.
Yeah, I mean, I think that where the bigger issues come in, I think where the Goodyear get their flack is more from the performance and the durability and the wear rather than the integrity of the carcass. I mean, if you want to look at a real issue, you look at Formula One in 2013, 14, 15-ish, when tires were exploding left, right, and center.
Or at least for NASCAR, just look at the 2008 Brickyard.
Yeah, that was a debacle. Yeah.
So they've got to, there is obviously pressure on them to form and make a product which is durable but also consistent. People don't mind tires that last 10 laps. They don't mind tires that last 60 laps. What they do mind is when you put the same compound on and one set lasts 10 and the other lasts 60. They need that consistency. And you're right to a certain extent that there are a certain amount of shenanigans going on with some of the tire compounds and the pressures and leaking tires and all this sort of stuff. As old as the hills when it comes to NASCAR, that sort of stuff. So sometimes, you've got to be, what's the saying? People in glass houses shouldn't throw stones, sort of thing. They've got to be a little bit careful, these guys in NASCAR, especially when they're playing the games. But I think on the whole, they make a pretty good product. I mean, you've got to look at, how many they have to manufacture, what loads and stresses they're going through. And, again, they've got to try and be reasonably consistent. The QC levels on these things are pretty high because, they do have to all be the same. And you talk to some of the older crew chiefs and each tire has a date and code stamp on it, and some of them swear that they pick out certain tires with certain date codes and all this sort of voodoo stuff. Is a complete lot of rubbish. But I think on the whole they do a pretty good job, and the drivers just want to complain about something.
Well, yeah, because you don't want it to be the driver's fault. So
exactly, and it's column inches, isn't it? It's column inches. It gets the name out there.
Yeah, so but this is a good segue to let's talk about the Xfinity race for a little bit, okay?
And speaking of QC, like you said, although it wasn't Goodyear, there was a QC issue in the Xfinity race, specifically with Brad Keselowski's roof hatch.
Yeah.
Lap 1, turn 1, the latch for the roof hatch that keeps it locked down failed. And NASCAR told Team Penske to work on a solution, try to come up with a game plan to fix it. Eventually, they removed the old hatch during one of the stage breaks, replaced it with the backup one, and about 5 laps after they went green, it had catastrophic failure, ripping off the car on the front stretch. Brad Keselowski described it as if he had time traveled back to the 1950s and was driving one of the convertibles on the beach. in the end, what caused it was a defect from the factory. Remember, these are all composite cars, so they're all made by the same factory, at least in theory. They're all made by the same factory. I believe Five Star Bodies produces them. So if that's a defect from the factory, could this also be something we could see with other cars or other defects in other areas?
Yeah, you'd want to hope. You'd want to hope it's an isolated incident, but to Kozlowski's point about driving a convertible, I mean, now Seth, I didn't see the issue you're talking about. So did the roof flap tore off?
Not the flap, the hatch. This is the emergency hatch in case the car were to flip. That driver could climb out through the roof.
Oh, okay. So the whole hatch. So literally, he was driving a convertible.
Yes.
Golly, that had to be scary.
On the TV coverage, they were sort of making it out as if it was a flap, which was a little bit misleading.
What I had read, I thought it was the flap. I didn't realize that he lost the whole roof of the car. Yeah, so
he lost the whole driver's side roof.
That's pretty scary. That's pretty scary.
And just some of the good stories that came out of the Xfinity race. Granted, it was all single file. It was won and dominated by Michael Annett. That was his first career victory in like 240 something starts. You had Ryan Sieg finishing fourth in his family-owned RSS Racing Chevrolet. His teammate, which that car usually starts in parks in 93, finished seventh, Jeff Green. You just had some good stories. The only drivers that were really trying to make something happen in the Xfinity Series, Chase Elliott, won the Cup drivers. I would say Brad Keselowski, but he never really had a chance because of the roof hatch issue. You had some other drivers qualify up inside the top 12, which it was very unusual for them. Cesar Baccarella in the number 90 for Mario Gosselin. He was running well until he cut a tire late, bounced off the wall. And Gray Gaulding, who also qualified inside the top 12 for Bobby Dollar's SS Greenlight Racing. The problem he had, he got spun on the backstretch for the race's only incident caution. He had two cautions that were for the stages, one for the debris from Brad Keselowski's car, and then when he got spun on the backstretch.
Okay, and the truck race then? Let's talk about the truck race for a little bit before we transition over to start talking about some IndyCar and Formula One news.
Okay, so I'm going to start off with the truck race by saying we had a record low for finishing trucks. Austin Hill got his first career win, surviving the carnage, having one of only two undamaged trucks throughout the entire race. The other one was Josh Rayom, who finished sixth in his self-owned Rayom Brothers Racing Chevrolet. And mind you, Josh Rayom started last in the field, and he was able to climb through the field, avoiding the wrecks to finish sixth. It started out in almost a, how should I word it, a Friday the 13th style. We had three trucks on the opening lap cut tires because of debris. Natalie Decker, her truck went up in flames. You had David Gilliland, he was able to salvage what looked to be a good finish until he got caught up in a wreck. And Brian Dozat, who bounced off the wall, his brake rotor exploded as a result, trying to warn his crew as he came to pit road. The Jackman, Billy Rock, didn't get the message or the warning, ran out and got hit. He cartwheeled, landing head first on the pavement. He has a broken right shoulder, which, if that's the only injury, that is actually pretty lucky. But one of the other good stories from the race, you had Angela Rooch, Derek Cope's niece. It was her first truck race since 2010. She led 2 laps in the race, her first laps that she's ever led, and she finished 8th. She had been running inside the top 5 for the bulk of the race, fell back when I believe she was beginning to lose a cylinder. But otherwise, she had a good run, and she's only the second woman to finish inside the top 10 in a truck race.
Fantastic. Good for her. Good for her. So we're on to Atlanta. And we're gonna make some picks here. And speaking of making picks, I am compelled to let you know that Hoobazoo.com, in addition to hosting Drafting the Circuits, we have a sister website now that is called PubNASCAR.com, and this is a pool you can get in and pick NASCAR drivers each week. And for a small fee, you can win bigger money if your picks win. Just check it out. There's a link to it on the Drafting the Circuits website. Otherwise, just go to hoobazoo.com/pubNASCAR and take a look at that. So, but speaking of which, so now our picks each week are going into the pool. We have our own DTC team. We get to pick 3 drivers a week, so there's 3 of us tonight, so we all get one and see how we do. So, who do you like for Atlanta, Richard?
Kevin Harvick.
And
Thanks.
Seth?
Sorry.
Well, since Harvick's been taken, let's go with Keselowski.
All right, so I'll go with Kyle Busch. So those are all pretty solid picks early in the season. All solid known winners. So that being said, let's turn our attention to IndyCar briefly. The IndyCars were testing down in COTA. Really strong high marks from the drivers on the circuit. And Richard, you and I talked last week about some of the time disparity between Formula One, so we don't need to kind of hash all that out again. But I guess the bigger news coming out of IndyCar is that the windscreen they were working on last year is not quite ready. The PPG Industries that is working on the glass has decided that even though the tests were successful and the drivers that tested these reported no problems with the vision, they've decided they're not quite ready to roll this out, and they require further testing and not a lot more detail than that. I don't know if they're worried about the integrity or the structure of the thing, or if they just simply want more test data. But in the meantime, the stopgap measure is called the AFP, the Advanced Frontal Protection, and it looks like a little nub on the front of the cockpit there. It looks like Richard, like you said, almost looks like a little camera mount.
Yeah.
And it's made of titanium. It's going to be standard on every chassis. And it's it's not as large and intrusive as the Halo, but it should smaller bits of debris should kind of deflect them away from the driver's helmet. So you're talking this is to take care of anything that's kind of slingshotted right towards there. But again, it's rather small. Again, my belief is it's a temporary measure until the windscreen is ready. So we'll just have to see how this plays out. Again, IndyCar fans tend to dislike the Halo, even though it's been proven in use. But anyway, I digress. But speaking of Halo, you'll find those on the 2019 Formula One cars, and all the 2019 Formula One cars were in Spain testing. Williams was late to the game, but they did make it. So, Richard, let's talk about some of the times coming out of out of Spain, and it seems like that the Honda engine is much improved since it's come out of the back of a McLaren and ended up into a Toro Rosso car.
Yeah, no, for sure. It's good to get back out there to see the cars on track again. So for 2019, a few driver changes, few drivers shuffling around there. I guess Pierre Gasly and Charles Leclerc in the Red Bull and Ferrari respectively are probably the 2 biggest stories. Williams being late to the party, unfortunately, that was another big story that's come out of there. They finally turned up today and got 20-something laps in. In reality, they've missed 3 days of testing, which is 3 days out of only a possible 8. So they're on the back foot already there, unfortunately, after a disastrous 2018.
Am I correct in a little tidbit I read? Did they actually showed up with last year's car? Or was that did I misread?
I don't think that's the case. I think that's
okay. So they do have a new car.
They had a new aero pack. Well, The chassis may be last year's chassis, but the aero was certainly 2019 regulations. And
Okay, all right.
they did say that there's new aero parts being delivered tonight for doing proper running on Thursday, on the final day of the 4. So yeah, I think it's a lot more than a 2018 car that they've got there. But the impressive times have come from Ferrari, most definitely. They've been very, very fast, consistent. Both drivers, Vettel and Charles Leclerc, very, very good. Mercedes, consistent, banging in lap after lap, as you have seen for the last few years from them. Maybe not had the pace, but you don't know what the program each individual team's in. You don't win anything in testing, apart from maybe a few sponsors if you're really desperate. And then, as you said earlier, the Honda engine in the Red Bull has been pretty good. There's been no reliability issues on that side. Pierre Gasly, I think it was yesterday, unfortunately went off and hit the wall reasonably hard, which could have caused a bit of damage. But again, they've been good, and I mean, because Red Bull are going to give very, very positive words on Honda, especially after their sort of acrimonious split from Renault, which seems to go on for 2 or 3 seasons. So yeah, you're starting to see Honda where you expect them to see them. Are they going to be up there competing and pushing Mercedes and Ferrari week in, week out? I doubt it. I still think there are a little bit of performance drop there, but it's certainly I think it's easier for Honda to improve from where they are in the field than where they were, unfortunately, with McLaren for those 3 seasons. The impressive team, I think, from pre-season testing so far has been Alfa Romeo. Continue on the phenomenal performance that they had last year as a Sauber team. I mean, I still think that 2018 Team of the Year was Sauber when you look at where they started in Melbourne to where they finished in Abu Dhabi. They went from scrapping at the last couple of places through to a regularly top 6 position, and they've certainly continued that so far during preseason testing. Been very, very impressive.
Plus this year they add Kimi Räikkönen to their driver lineup.
Well, they've got Kimi in there and Giovinazzi as well. So they've got 2. They've got a very experienced driver and a young kid who's come through with lots of promise. So yeah, you hope that that continues, because they're although they're now branded as Alfa Romeo, they are still Sauber. They've kept the chassis names. I think it's C38. I think they're up to now. So they're keeping the Sauber sort of naming system, which I think is quite good. Outside of Williams, the most disappointing team I think has probably been Haas. They've had a lot of issues and stopped on track 2 or 3 times at least, maybe even 4 now. And back in the day, I remember going to pre-season tests when I was working for Honda, and if you got 20 laps in a day, it was a good day. Now you're doing 120 laps. So to have those sort of issues, even now, like fuel pressure pickup problems, in 2019, they shouldn't be happening, really. They should be better than that. So it's disappointing to see that from those guys. They've certainly got potential. They've got the new sponsorship deal. So we'll see how they go there. Other little things to note: Renault had an embarrassing DRS failure. The rear wing failed, which ditched Ricciardo into a spin. He was lucky he didn't hit anything solid. Managed to get that one out of the gravel traps there.
One thing I just wanted to throw out here is that the Alfa Romeo as a passenger car brand has been funneling a lot of money into U.S. advertising in the last year and a half. Yep. They're really trying to relaunch the brand of Alfa Romeo in the United States, and I'm sure that this branding of the Formula One team is going to tie into that somehow. Definitely. So I just feel like there's, like Sauber is getting really solid factory support, from Ferrari / Alfa Romeo compared to what Haas is getting, and I think, because we've talked about Renault or being the number 4 team, but I feel like we've maybe overlooked.
Oh, for sure.
Sauber in this deal, they could vault themselves right up there.
Now, without knowing the true connection, and the inside details, obviously, last year there was a lot of talk about Haas being the sort of Ferrari B team, and to a certain extent, I think a lot of that is possibly true. But you look at what Sauber have done and Alfa Romeo have done. They're a lot more independent, I think, than Haas are. They make their own in-house. They make their own chassis. They've got their own wind tunnel. They have a pretty big setup. Haas owns the old Virgin Racing Marussia facility in the UK, and the chassis and everything and the aero is done in Italy. So it's a little bit more disconnected. And I think over time that will start to sort of show. You do need everything all under one roof. But one quick thing that was released this week, which sort of gives us a little bit of an insight into 2021 and beyond, which is when the big rule changes are coming in Formula One. The FIA have put out a tender for a standard gearbox, internals. So, and it's a pretty quick turnaround. I think the deadline is like March 15th for companies like X-Track and the guys like that to submit a plan. So the internal mechanisms of the gearbox will be standard and a 7-speed gearbox rather than the current 8. There'll be 7-speed gearbox, but the teams will be allowed to design their own casing. So for some teams who buy in rear-end gearbox transmission, I think Racing Force or Point or whatever they're called these days, they buy the system from Mercedes. Toro Rosso obviously gets it from Red Bull. I believe Haas gets their rear end from Ferrari. They'll now have to start making proprietary rear end housings as well. And, it'll be interesting to see how that one works.
Yeah, it sure will. So they've got they got to test Thursday coming up, which will be done by the time we go in the air. And then is there another test before?
I think there's a week off, and then there's another 4-day test. Then there's a week off, then it's Melbourne. So I think Melbourne's sort of 17th of March, or maybe the week after.
I want to say yes, the week after the IndyCar season opener, which is on March 10th, and then Melbourne's the week after that. So, but guys, we are out of time. So, Richard, thank you so much. Seth, thank you so much. I appreciate you guys. I want to thank our guest again, Spencer Pumpelly, for coming on. He was fantastic just to chat with. I want to thank all you folks that listen to us. I want to thank the Hoobazoo Radio Network, and I want to tell all you folks good night. Talk to you in a week.
Hoobazoo.com